Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof. Thank you for joining us for this week's Dissenter Weekly. It's March 18th, 2021. And before we get rolling on our whistleblower stories for the week, Brian has a few things for you.
Hi, Kevin, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just your periodic reminder to make sure that you're following, if you're not already, wherever you are watching this right now. If you're watching on YouTube, you can also support us by making donations during the show. But otherwise, we are a 100% reader-funded publication. We pay our writers and fund the website through small dollar donations from people like you. So if you like the work we're doing and you want to help and you're in a position to spare some money, you can head over to shadowproof.com/donate and chip in. We'll also talk about Kevin's newsletter, which you can subscribe to as another way to support us at the end of the show. And yeah, we really appreciate everyone as well who tunes in and comments and shares and all that. So thank you for being here with us today. Let's jump right in here. We have a few stories this week. The first one here, Biden is accused of using Trump rule to fire a whistleblower. Tell us about this story.
Yes, so this comes from the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, and they are a group that represents employees of the federal government, particularly those who are involved in agencies that have a responsibility to protect the environment, as it says in their name, or also they could be involved in public health matters. And this environmental analyst at the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, so that would be BLM. But when I say that, I'm not talking about Black Lives Matter. This is the acronym for the government agency. So at BLM, this analyst is facing termination for persisting in raising concerns about the potential for devastating impacts on raptors, or that's the term for birds of prey, and other wildlife that is in and around this massive Wyoming oil and gas project. This is from Pierre's press release. The publication Government Executive reported on this and added a layer to what's going on with this whistleblower and said that Joe Biden's administration is relying on a Trump-era initiative that made it easier for the government to fire federal employees. And so this was a policy that we thought the government was no longer going to rely on in order to force people out who raised concerns with their superiors. But it appears to be happening to Loewen, who was a planning, or he still is, he hasn't actually been fired successfully yet, but he's a planning and environmental coordinator at the Bureau of Land Management. His supervisors say, and this is common in whistleblower cases, that his work performance is inadequate and they've given him 30 days to improve. So you get a timeline. So essentially, under this rule that was adopted with President Trump in office, you get a timeline, and if you don't live up to some expectation, then that gives your supervisor the authority to dismiss you, and it makes it look like it wasn't done without cause. So his dismissal is still pending a sign-off from management. He raised concerns about this oil and gas project. I think he refused to sign off on an environmental impact statement. But what Pierre says in more detail in the release is that he stressed to the leadership of the Bureau of Land Management that there's a high potential for mortality from this oil and gas project, that it could particularly impact the ferruginous hawk. And after he made these disclosures, Mr. Loewen was removed from any further environmental work on this and any other related projects. He was sidelined into what they refer to as make work tasks. So we'll just say as like tedious matters that don't really have any significance beyond the bureaucratic functions or the daily bureaucratic functions of BLM. The Wyoming State Office proposed removing him from federal service for alleged performance issues on his new tasks, despite the fact that he has a record of strong performance previously. So that's where we're talking about using this rule in order to axe the civil service or the federal employees. Now, apparently, according to Peer, Biden did scrap the plan that was going to allow for killing of migratory birds by industry operations. But BLM still estimates for this project that I haven't seen any evidence that it's not going to continue with this plan. That 1,500 non-eagle birds of prey and their nests would be devastated or could be devastated. They're at risk as a result of this project. The plan that BLM approved involves 5,000 oil and gas wells, 500 miles of gas pipeline, 900 miles of water pipeline, new roads, and electrical lines. And analysts had raised concerns that this would degrade the nesting sites of these birds. We're talking also kestrels, owls, and there's other species that would be impacted by all of these pipeline projects. And so there's a lot that could be said about all of it, but the most important being it is a classic example of wearing down somebody in an agency in order to get them to leave and no longer work in this agency because they happen to have a conscience and do care about the policy's impact as they are reviewing certain plans.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next story here involves a Shell pipeline that is facing investigation after whistleblowers expose safety risks. What is this story about?
Yeah, and improbably, the name of this pipeline is Falcon. So we just talked about birds and pipelines, and now we're talking about a pipeline that's actually called Falcon. And I'd imagine if there were any birds near there, they're not living there anymore. I imagine it's not a habitat for any wildlife species anymore. And so this is in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. This is a local newspaper in Pennsylvania. They report in 2020, a top environmental official in the state tried to raise alarm at the highest levels of the federal agency responsible for pipeline safety. That Patrick McDonald, the Secretary of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, provided credible information involving this Falcon project. He suggested it was constructed with, quote, defective corrosion coating protection and referred to witnesses with, quote, firsthand knowledge of bad corrosion coatings, falsification of records and reports, and retaliatory firings and other actions by Shell. So all of this looks like a clear example of corruption to further the profits of Shell, the business operations of Shell, which is, their horrific record extends to human rights abuses in actually the Horn of Africa. And so worldwide, this is the way the company tends to function. And the newspaper notes, for those who are unfamiliar with how the pipeline might be constructed, that the coating is designed to protect the metal pipeline from being exposed to elements that could cause corrosion. It's not supposed to occur early in the pipeline's life, but as it ages, this is why we have ruptures, and there are major gushers that end up polluting lands and water nearby pipelines. This information was brought to Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao. Of course, that's the partner and wife of Senate leader. He was the majority leader. He's not anymore, Mitch McConnell. And then members of Congress who were on transportation committees were notified about these pipeline risks. The warning came in February of 2020. And so people know an ethane pipeline, ethane's a constituent of petroleum and natural gas. This pipeline that we're talking about is a 98-mile link, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, that goes between gas processing plants in Ohio and Washington County. And then there's a petrochemical complex that Royal Dutch Shell built in a county in Pennsylvania called Beaver County. And apparently, this is not the first whistleblower to come forward, or an example of some people blowing the whistle on the project. There's a whistleblower that came forward in early 2019 with concerns about the project and raised issues with the installation of it and the operation. So it's important to know that oftentimes, in addition to the environmental impact of these pipelines, they're just shoddily built. They're very quickly thrown together. They're cheaply made. And that's the reason why they deteriorate pretty quickly. When it came across, when they were investigating, their agencies were given this information. They're looking at concerns that that drilling mud spills on the pipeline had not been reported appropriately. They were alarmed. These agencies, it says in Pittsburgh Post-Gazette story that there was alarm, that they began to bring in more investigators, that the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office was then involved. So it seems like there's a lot of people in these agencies who are aware about the faulty nature of the Falcon project by Shell, and yet it somehow has continued. So this is an important piece of journalism from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll have to see if it has any kind of fallout. Will it create some kind of obstacle to the project? Will it force it to be scrapped? Will it lead to any kind of activism around this pipeline? I don't know. And I think there's a lot of questions here. Will these whistleblowers be vindicated? Is there some way that they'll be rewarded for coming forward anonymously? Or I don't know if any of their identities are known. Is there anything that will happen to this project? And we'll have to come back to this at a later date and see if there's anything substantive that comes from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's reporting.
Absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that and for calling out the name of the journalists and the publication as well. That's wonderful. For our next segment here, I see that you want to celebrate the Challenger disaster whistleblower, Allan McDonald. Tell us a little bit about Allan and his role there.
Yeah, and so Allan, he recently died a little less than a week ago, and so I thought it would be good to give a bit of a tribute to him, and for those who are unfamiliar with what happened, just to lay it all out, take a moment to lay some of this out. And so I've got a story from Interesting Engineering that lays this all out, but I also have a report that I had pulled up. Just take a moment to pull this up. So this basically lays out the chronology of what happened with Allan, and he was a classic whistleblower in the 80s. I believe that most people who don't know exactly what led up to the Challenger disaster at least know that it was a space shuttle disaster, and it was a remarkable tragedy because there was one of the first civilians, I think the first civilian, was on board and perished in the disaster. And so his story is an important one because he's one of two people who had actually challenged the safety issues with the space shuttle and its engineering prior to launch, and even such, this still went forward. The launch still went forward on January 28th, 1986, and then tragedy occurred. And it didn't. And the point of all of this is to say that it didn't have to happen. And someone, one of those people being Allan McDonald, he spoke up. He was a manager of this rocket motor project at Morton Vehicle. This was at the Kennedy. He was at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and it points out that in this chronology that he was able to he was able to talk to the Utah office and share his concern about the solid rocket booster field joints in the cold weather that was occurring in Florida at the time. He gave his concern to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And then after a number of phone calls between Marshall and employees, there was a telephone conference among engineers and managers in Florida, Alabama, and Utah that was set up. And so in all of this, they have a conference and they're talking. McDonald continues to argue for a delay this day. He refuses to sign off on the launch, which was an unprecedented move. And he had supported previous launches of shuttles. So to do this would signal quite a dissent against going forward with the launch. The Space Shuttle Challenger was then launched in temperatures that were 15 degrees colder, we're going off of Fahrenheit, than any previous launch. It exploded 73 seconds after launching due to a failure in the field joint, which is called the O-ring, and this was on the right solid rocket booster. And then there was, they had a commission that was appointed, ended up doing an investigation. Of course, this was now a very big public event that people wanted to know what led to this tragedy. And McDonald told a commission that was impaneled that NASA officials objected when Morton Vehicle, this company where he's working, initially opposed launching the shuttle. He says the usual system of the contractor having to prove the vehicle was safe was reversed. This time, the engineers were asked to prove it was not safe. And so that put them in a situation where they had to prove the negative. Roger Boasjoli is another engineer who was with Allan McDonald, and he mentioned that he had written that unless the seals were improved, the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. But in all of this, McDonald was reassigned from work, and there was anger. There was anger against him for relaying complaints about NASA's investigation of the accident to the commission that was impaneled to investigate the Challenger disaster. Congress people complained, and then McDonald was reinstated, was assigned to head the booster rocket redesign. And so this is just, again, as we talk about sometime on the show, classic examples of whistleblower stories. This is a classic example, something that occurred a long time ago, very nearly around 35 years ago. And with it, I think it's just important to pay tribute to people like Allan McDonald, who are willing to go on record. And it may not be the most, it may not have the highest stakes. We're talking about a space shuttle launch. It's not a matter of war. It doesn't involve environmental destruction by a pipeline. But if the science and engineering isn't done right, then people are going to die. And people who knew that those individuals could die and still went forward, I think it can be said that they have blood on their hands for going forward and not listening to those who were experts in the engineering. And so having somebody who can speak up during an expensive government project, all the eyes are watching, everyone's wanting to see the Challenger launch go forward, knowing that someone like Allan McDonald is there and that there are other Allan McDonalds in our government is good, because those people are going to be on record. So after the fact, unfortunately, if there are tragedies after the fact, we find people like Allan McDonald, so we can see very clearly that something was done that was improper.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next story here, I believe you touched on a little bit in some of your writing and your newsletter. We have the Freedom of Information Act in crisis. What should Joe Biden do about it? Why don't you share some of your thoughts here on what the situation is and what can be done about it?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I wanted to take this part of the show to promote the report I put together. It's Sunshine Week, and it's something that I think is important for all citizens. We've seen record numbers of Freedom of Information Act requests. It's available to citizens. Anyone can request information from government agencies. The people who tend to do it the most are journalists and media organizations. And then it's media organizations that have the resources to hire lawyers and fight for the release of records. And those are the people that tend to rely on it the most. It serves journalism, but anybody who wants to have information about what agency is doing, an agency might be doing in the city level, county level, state level, national level, can do it because we have this framework that exists nationally, and I think it trickles down, so to speak, even though, I'm not suggesting that there's like trickle down transparency in the United States, but which sounds like a ridiculous Reagan concept. But I mean that just everyone's inspired to have transparency processes and ways that people can obtain information at all levels of this country. And so we have Sunshine Week. And I think it's important for people to know that there's been quite an erosion of openness when it comes to the Freedom of Information Act over the last decade. There's no question that Donald Trump's administration was openly hostile toward FOIA. There's no question that people who were officials in the agencies of government, especially Attorney General Bill Barr, people who ran the EPA, the Interior Department, who wanted to hide what we talked about in the opening of this show, hide how they were selling off public land to the fossil fuel industry and how they were allowing environmental destruction. They didn't want to have to reveal those business meetings, the lobbying that was going on. And so there was a lot of obstructing of access to information that usually would be made immediately available because they knew that there was corruption that would be exposed through those Freedom of Information Act requests. And so, let me say that in my report that I did, which is at dissenter.substack.com, part of the Dissenter newsletter, I don't let the Obama administration off the hook. I point out that when you look at the numbers, the extent to which files were censored and denied to people who made Freedom of Information Act requests, it wasn't that much worse than the rate under President Obama's administration. And so even if the Obama administration didn't talk in an openly hostile manner against FOIA, it didn't necessarily mean that they were always serving FOIA. It didn't mean that they were always serving transparency. And it's worth noting that both President Donald Trump and Barack Obama said that they were the most transparent administrations ever, made that claim. And so with that, we have Merrick Garland, who is now the Attorney General, and there are things that he could do today in order to improve FOIA. And I think it's worth throwing out a couple of those things that we need to see. We need proactive declassification of records. There should be some kind of a program on the part of the US government to go through files in these agencies to clear backlogs, to deal with some of the overclassification. And maybe they want to start with some of the least controversial materials, but all of that's going to deal constructively with a backlog that should not exist. That is pretty, it's substantial at this point. And it means that in order for us to get records that should already be public, we have to go through the work to make these requests. And they could just automatically post documents to reading rooms for people, as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was doing following NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden's disclosures. And that would be an effective way of declassifying material that we all should be able to access. And it would be helpful. Not only would I use it for my journalism, but I think there are citizens who might benefit from being able to basically look at some of these and perhaps share them around in any of their groups. Whether they're activists or not, there might be something that they could benefit from learning in these materials. And beyond that, the other thing they could do is enforce a foreseeable harm standard and describe to us in specifics when they deny requests and claim national security as the reason. Give some kind of specific detail as to what they believe would happen if those records were revealed. They often abuse this. The national security exemptions have been claimed at a record. There's been a record spike in the amount of time that it's used, going from Obama to Donald Trump. We could take drones as an example. Some of that information was public as a result of pressure and lawsuits by the American Civil Liberties Union. There was information that the Obama administration started to tell us on a regular basis, but then Donald Trump decided that did not need to be public information. And now, it's pretty clear that we need to have some kind of a system within FOIA that would give you more than just the name of the exemption if it is claimed around national security. They should tell you exactly what they believe would happen. And with that information, you could decide whether to accept it or not. It would give you the power to go to the courts and say that you don't believe this. And definitely the courts will be pretty deferential to the US government. You will have an uphill struggle in prying these files loose. But if you're able to demonstrate that what they're telling you is totally bogus, then you might have some hope of getting the documents that you're trying to have released. So those are two main things. And the third thing I'd say is that the Justice Department could not oppose, could choose to back and advocate for the expansion of the Freedom of Information Act and the reform of this law that's over a half century old at this point. The Justice Department has privately lobbied against FOIA reform in the past. This happened under President Barack Obama. It was somewhat stunning. Jason Leopold, a reporter well known for his FOIA-ing, did a report for Vice that exposed how this was going on in the background in 2014, that the administration was sabotaging, undermining any effort to reform the Freedom of Information Act. And they didn't want certain things that were part of Obama's presidential policies to be made law in a way that would make it enforceable, and that they would have to abide by it. They wanted to just be able to voluntarily choose if they supported FOIA in the way that they were claiming to. So this is the way liberals are. They want to have credit for the things they say without actually putting action to it. And so with that, the important thing for Merrick Garland and the Justice Department, if they believe in things that they're putting out for Sunshine Week, they should go forward and support whatever the Senate or the House of Representatives decide to do in the way of fixing FOIA. And I do believe that we'll see something done. I don't believe that we'll go through the next 2 to 4 years here without seeing something proposed. And FOIA has pretty good bipartisan support, since no matter your politics, you can use it, and the information you obtain can be weaponized however you would like. There's a right-wing outfit called Judicial Watch that does some important work fighting for FOIA. And then obviously ACLU is more aligned with the Democratic Party in its politics, and they're constantly fighting for the expansion of FOIA. So, no matter what allegiance you have as far as these groups, this is important. And I think that the Justice Department should abandon any effort to oppose expanding the Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move on to our last story that we have queued up here. Australian members of Parliament urge the British government to free Julian Assange. What do you have on this? And if you have any other Julian Assange updates, why don't you share those with us too?
Yeah, thank you for that, Brian. And we'll wrap up the show after we get done with our Assange update. So we have members of Parliament that are in Australia. They are urging the British government to free Assange, allow him to be released. They would like the Justice Department to drop the charges against him. And so the MP in Australia, his name is Andrew Wilkie, was participating in an event with John Shipton, who is Julian Assange's father, and said, "I can speak with personal experience of what a dreadful place Belmarsh prison is." Of course, this is where Julian Assange is being held in detention. Wilkie said, "It's the last place to detain a journalist. It's the last place to detain someone who won their court case and should have been allowed to walk free. This is indefinite detention, wrong on so many levels." Then a senator in Australia named Peter Wilson declared, "If we go after the truth tellers of the Iraq War, what does it say about the importance of the truth? The road from here will only get more dark and more dangerous." Another senator named Janet Rice in Australia has come out in support of Assange, saying, "For telling the truth, for revealing war crimes, for speaking truth to power. That's why he is there, because the powerful did not want to hear the truth that he was telling." And then we have a member of Parliament named Julian Hill urging the Australian government to oppose the prosecution, saying that with the right diplomacy, the Biden administration could conclude this immediately. The treatment of Assange corrupts our alliances with the US and makes a mockery of the UK's justice system and international law. It's all part of a global campaign going on right now to pressure Joe Biden's Justice Department into dropping the charges against Assange, which were brought under President Donald Trump. And so with that, I would like to take a moment to, I'm going to put up on the screen some slides that show an event that is going to be taking place on March 20th. We will be sharing the link with our Shadowproof accounts. And let's see, let me go. So the first one here is, let's see if we got that up on the screen. Okay, so there's going to be a free Assange forum that is occurring on March 20th. As you can see, this will be a really long event, so I don't expect any of you to watch all of this, but there will be a whole bunch of panels that you can tune into. And Katie Halper, who's co-hosts the Useful Idiots podcast and also has her own show, along with Jen Perlman, who Jen's the leader in organizing all of this. The people with her have put together this in order to pressure on this day. They're going to be encouraging calls to the Justice Department and lobbying by citizens to demand that Biden's administration drop the charges against Julian Assange. And we're going to be using these hours to demand this action. And then I'll go forward to the other slide here that we have. So later, I'll be the first panel. I'll be part of the first panel. And after they introduce and set everything up, that be, well, I don't have this in the right order. So these are three. So one of the panels at 4 o'clock is going to be with Jordan and Kate and Justin here. And each of these people are going to be talking about the case from the standpoint of independent media, which I could speak to, but we're going to let them speak about that. And they are going to talk about the ways that corporate media have been failing when it comes to this case. Then this other panel, the second panel that is going to take place. Let's see. I have to. There's no better way for me to do this. I wish there was. This is a little clunky, but let me. All right, so there's me. This is the panel that is going to take place at 2 p.m. Eastern, and I'll be joined by Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, and then John Kiriakou, a good friend of ours, is going to be part of this, and we'll be breaking down a lot of the military-industrial complex's influence over this case, and why we're seeing this prosecution. And then if I can put up, I should be able to put up this other. Let's pull this down, and I will show you the other. So for our last and final slide that I need to share with you, my co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, Rania Kalik, will be joining and participating in this panel with Lee Camp and also Ron Placone. And I understand that they're going to be talking about some of, again, moving this conversation on to talk about the foreign policy aspects and some of what has gone on in the case that relates to the U.S. and its global influence in the world. And as this goes through, the panel is not going to just talk about Julian Assange. It's going to do a good job of talking about a lot of the different issues that are related with Assange as well. And it should be there should be some good conversations. Understand nobody's going to be able to catch it all, but we'll highlight some of the clips from my panel, and there might be some other clips that we can pull and share later depending on what happens. So I'll be keeping tabs on this on Saturday. All right, let's pull this down. Stop the screen. All right, that was clunky. I apologize. There's really no more streamlined way of doing that.
That's all good. That's independent journalism.
Yeah, we just go through the in a low budget way, and then users on YouTube can tell us later. Did you know that your screen wasn't actually open when you? Yes, I did. I did know. I didn't want it to do that. I mean, if we could be slick like CNN, I'd be slick like CNN.
Donate. Subscribe to Kevin's newsletter, and we can one day hire a producer who can move everything around.
So we talked before, and as we wind down and close the show, sometimes we veer off into topics unrelated, and so I mentioned to you that there's a couple examples here that fit our Marvel Cook Fellowship and why we need abolition of policing. So just thought for people who are watching, I'll raise a couple of these examples and you can maybe give your reaction to the pros and cons of
we can do a dunk tank.
Yeah. So Bill de Blasio, who of course is the epitome of a liberal who thinks he's going to be reforming the police while actually when he proposes those policies, they just give more power to the police. This comes from Matthew Chase, who is a reporter with Newsday. And he announced that Bill de Blasio would like the NYPD to confront those who commit hateful but non-criminal conduct. And the quote from Bill de Blasio is, "I assure you, if an NYPD officer calls you or shows up at your door to ask about something you did, that makes people think twice. And we need that." And then the rest of the quote is, "I think that has an educating impact on people. I think that has a sobering impact that we need. Do we need this, Brian?
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's kind of like scared straight for the masses, I guess. Is his idea is that we're gonna fight hate with terror, with police terror, I guess, to just go around and frighten people. It's also interesting considering like the completely insane overlap between people involved in hateful acts, I guess, and law enforcement itself. I don't know. Are the cops going to be showing up at each other's doors, talking about their conduct while they were at work that day? Or it's just, I was saying to you earlier, it just strikes me as kind of like the epitome of like not giving a shit. Like not.
It's a very lazy proposal, right?
Yeah, it's
Like
it's so insulting, I feel like, to say something like that, especially after the year that we've been through and like how obvious it is, even to somebody who like, let's say, would not consider themselves quite yet like an abolitionist. I feel like it should be absurd on its face to think that that is an appropriate response to something as complex and as just having no real. I don't understand what the police are. There's no like theory of change here. Like I don't understand what the point is of this proposal.
it's tone deafness. It's
Yeah.
pretty much like peak tone deafness. Like you said, to go through a year where everything we talk about is about how can you have other things solved without police. Like
Yeah.
we've had a transformation in the last 6 to 10 months where the majority, I think if you took a poll, would say, can we do this without bringing police? Then let's
Mhm.
do this without bringing police into it. And
Yeah.
personally, educating people on how not to be hateful, we probably can do that without police. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and
I
I
don't
mean,
know what the
we
program would
also,
look.
yeah,
Good.
to a certain degree, like, yes, there is an educational component to hate, but there's also a much larger structural component that I feel like would do far more faster if we were to address it sooner,
Sure.
you know?
Well, the key for me there though is that he's saying it's not there's no crimes. There's no
Yeah.
like they're saying the police are going to come to your door. You didn't commit a crime, but we're just going to be like, all right, I just want to tell you, you want to be
Yeah.
careful.
Yeah.
Going to
It's,
intimidate you. And
Yeah, I don't know.
okay.
It's very weird, and I feel like the whole part about it not being a crime seems to me like some kind of a weird like sugarcoating on top of the actual issue, and I also think that it's kind of, at least the way you described it to me, I hadn't really seen it before, but it's so like ambiguous. And I was telling you earlier, I wanted to shout out the book, a book by Garrett Felber. Oh shit, I'm blanking on the name. I'm so sorry, Garrett. I will make sure to link to it in the comments. It's Garrett Felber came out with this book very recently. It's about the Nation of Islam, and it's about policing and Malcolm X. And they talk about this documentary that came out, I think, in the 50s or 60s called "The Hate That Hate Produced." And basically how there was this element of like pushing back on the civil rights movement and a movement centered on police brutality by framing hatred, almost as kind of like in a universal sense, so like, for instance, Black people who were involved in civil rights work were engaging, and particularly those who were involved through Muslim organizations and so-called Black Muslim organizations were engaged in their own kind of hate work in their efforts to fight hate. And so I think that right here is like a very perilous situation to be in, as we see in places like Alabama. They're trying to criminalize protest further. There's definitely kind of this, I feel like underneath the surface of like the woke discourse, there's kind of this burgeoning like the cancel culture discourse reminds me of like reverse racism in that whole discourse sometimes. So I don't know, it just reminded me. Garrett's book is called Those Who Know Don't Say. You should definitely,
I was about to help you.
Yeah, you should definitely check it out. I apologize for that. Super good book, and it's interesting for this conversation.
So then the second example comes from my city of Chicago, which we've had quite a struggle by the teachers union here, led by some very wonderful, righteous activists who have spent the last weeks forcing the CPS, or the Chicago Public Schools, which I need to make clear to you as I announce what's going on. This context is actually important for people to know why this is coming through as a proposed policy. There's no elected school board. So like the only big city, one of the only big cities in the United States that doesn't have an elected school board. It's done by mayoral appointees, which Rahm Emanuel used to have that kind of power. And now it's Lori Lightfoot, who is kind of his protege. So the policy that is being suggested in the midst of acrimony and discontent between both the union and the city, because the city still is resistant to sensible ideas for reopening schools and coming back from a pandemic. The policy being thrown around by Lori Lightfoot is that the DCFS, which I don't really know all of that acronym, but this is basically social services.
Yeah, right.
Or child protective services. And the CPD should, when a parent or guardian is not able to pick up their child after school, and this is after schools reopen, if there are still kids that are not there, that the social services and CPD should go pick up the kids when the parents don't come to pick them up. So in other words, we're saying that if the parents do not come pick up the children, we're going to have the police come pick up the children, or the social services are going to come pick up the children. That's the solution. Instead of having kids sit around after school, we're going to have the police come pick them up and take care of them.
Yeah. I mean, one way to think about this, I think, is that I was thinking about this too recently when people were talking about getting the vaccines out and like what kind of infrastructure we have to do, what kind of infrastructure we have available to rely on to do something like that. And naturally, everybody turned to the military, right? Like the military has this capacity to do this kind of thing. And I think especially on like a state and local level, I mean, it really says a lot that like the cops are sort of like the infrastructure, and that includes the Department of Child and Family Services, which is its own sort of police force, its own sort of policing, family policing, I would say. Yeah. It's interesting.
Informants for police.
Yeah, absolutely. Informants for police. They have, I'm sure people out there who are like, well, I know somebody who's doing, who has a big heart and is doing like amazing work with children. And I'm not trying to have like an individual analysis like that. I'm saying as a structure, it is a very punitive structure that actually ends up policing families and family behaviors and family economic situations. But my point being that as a government can organize in any conceivable way. Like we could have capacity to help kids get home from school that has absolutely nothing to do with law enforcement. There's like absolutely no reason why anybody who has anything to do with punishing families and kids or like keeping them in line and to some sort of degree has to be like the government infrastructure for doing something like this. And yet that's where all of the money has been invested in capacity. Like we could barely even deliver the fucking mail, as we saw this past year, but like we can call up the cops to do just about anything because that's where all the funding and personnel and training and all the equipment and all you know what I mean? It's mind-boggling to me. And I'm sure from the city's perspective, it makes total sense. Like who else could you possibly call on to do something like this? And that's just so warped to me that's the situation we're in.
It also, the last thing I'll say as we conclude, and I know we've been going a little long, but the idea of police being involved in this, there's no way you can consider it as a kind of public service that they're providing. Like it's not aid. It's not like they're a relief organization taking care of children who shouldn't fall through the cracks. the act of taking somebody wherever, like, what are they going to do? That's the thing that, I don't really know how this actually works, but do the police take you back to the station and then parents have to come claim their children at the station? Same with the family services or the social services agency. Do you have to go there and pick them up? Do they come drop them off at home? But if nobody's nobody's there at that house, they can't leave the child there. So then that kid's going to be.
That becomes surveillance of a sort too, like
right,
if you have these home visits, basically,
And where I'm leading is there's no way that this can be, for lack of a better word, charity, or just like I'm part of the neighborhood and I have to, serve the community.
Yeah,
there's no way. Yeah. There's no way it can be just that. We all know that this is how investigations get opened, that are fishing expeditions for, what kind of parent is this? What kind of mom does this child have? What kind of dad does this child have?
Yeah.
They're not going to just deal with this as a one-off issue and the parents didn't show up. It's going to be, this must be reflective of criminal or negligent delinquent behavior that we have to investigate so that it doesn't happen.
Well, and if I could chime in, like one other thing that I think is important to pull from this, and I think maybe we've talked about recently on the show, is that again, like COVID, the pandemic really laid bare that school is childcare. Like that is really the issue here. I feel like we just had this conversation like a couple weeks ago on a different topic, but like the whole issue about like the parents being at work and there's nobody to get home, it's because like, I mean, that's a labor issue more than anything. It's a childcare issue more than anything. I mean, yeah, we're talking about schools and policing, and I think undeniably that's part of it. But like, if we're talking about this from an abolitionist framework, like we should also be paying attention to that aspect of it. And I think it just underscores, again, this drive to reopen without any real concern for the people who have to do it. And also not really any concern for the kids too, who I feel like often are sort of treated like, oh, they're not getting the socialization they need and they're falling behind, which is true. But also, like, if I was a little kid and I knew there was like a deadly virus going around and I saw like all of this shit going on, I would be fucking scared shitless if I had to go to school every day, And I'm like, sure, kids are like pulling their masks off and like what kids are like on the playground and stuff. Like,
sure, he just coughed on me. He gave me the virus.
Exactly. Like
even if that's not true, like,
right.
It can't,
but it underscores that like that's what this is all about, is that like school is de facto childcare because we don't provide that kind of care, because again, like we don't have a government built around that. All the money goes to the police, and like that's just the only place that, like, I almost feel like slowly the government is just becoming police, right? Like,
yeah, well,
like they just provide any fucking service that we don't have but we need. I guess we'll just call in, or the military, we'll just call in the National Guard to deal with it. Because we've just divested from government and given up on the project like altogether.
Yeah. So as we wrap, I'll just throw out there that here in the city, we had a mini scandal that didn't become as much of a scandal as it should have, but we found out that a large percent of federal funds from the COVID-19 bill were actually put into the Chicago Police Department to help make payroll. And I presume that it was actually to cover overtime costs from policing the
100%.
Protests after George Floyd and the rebellion around all of that. So in that sense, and there's a great report that was done by our Inspector General, which I won't get into, that outlined all sorts of brutality and violence that was committed during these days. And so that's what was funded. We had to pay the police and the money that they were that we had to pay for the hours that they were out on the streets during that. All right, so let's put up the link for the newsletter, and we'll wrap it up. That's been a good, nearly hour-long conversation.
Yeah, I would say too that I'm sure some of that money is also for settling lawsuits. Like I'm seeing
Oh,
here, Chicago paid $115,000 to settle 2 lawsuits.
Yeah.
Involving excessive force.
My
Like,
cat's joining us.
oh,
Hello.
excellent, wonderful cameo.
Hey. All right, go get in your window. Jump. Thank you. I'm gonna wrap. That's the newsletter link, dissenter.substack.com. A lot of you watch this already. You'll know that this is the newsletter where we cover whistleblower stories and also provide updates on Julian Assange's case. In the past week, we did some, I did a really long report on the Freedom of Information Act. And so you can read that there if that's something that's of interest, although writing about FOIA can be pretty boring. And yes, I am denigrating my own work. So, which is kind of like sabotaging your own self. But if you go there, there's still a discount that you can use to get an annual subscription if you'd like to take that opportunity. And then we've got the telethon for Free Assange on March 20th, which I encourage you all to drop by and at least watch one of the panels, not even my panel. You don't have to watch just my panel, but in addition to the activism that I know is going out there was a Clovers for Assange event on St. Patrick's Day that some grassroots activists organized. In addition to that, I encourage you to tune into this because it's a big deal. I think, getting Katie Halper and Jen involved, this is giving this issue a wider platform within the left or progressive left space.
Yes.
And I know it's effective. I know it's already going to be effective because when I was sharing this, I was immediately hit with a swarm of K-Hive style people who the only thing they could post was that we were giving attention to a rapist and that we should consider having Bill Cosby or Woody Allen on to talk about Julian Assange, which just shows that they have absolutely no idea about what we're doing and they don't even care. And the thing is, you can't engage these people. They don't have any clue because when you try to talk to them about the charges, they don't even know what he's being charged with. And they basically just want him, I've come to the conclusion, they just want him to die in prison so that they don't ever have to deal with his existence ever again. Because he forces them to consider so many hard issues about America that they don't want to have to reflect on. Mm-hmm. So I encourage you to watch this panel because it's Katie and to some degree Jen. There's going to be a backlash from Kamala and Joe Biden supporters, and that's going to be fun. So you won't want to miss whatever conflict we create within the left and with liberals. That's all I have to say. Thanks, Brian, for being here. We've gone for like an hour. I didn't mean to last this long, but we got pulled in some good conversation.
Yeah, so I appreciate you pulling this show together. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will catch you next Thursday at 4 p.m. East. Please stay safe out there.